Morning blessings. For this time, for our session, I would like to address the theme of the three jewels, or also called the three treasures in the Buddhist tradition. These are the three pillars that make what awakening is all about. They are the Buddha, the awakened one, the Dharma, that truth, that liberating truth that the Buddha realized and therefore embodied, and then the community of followers who are also on the path of awakening and who support one another on that path. So the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha. So today I will address the theme of Buddha, the awakened one. So who is the awakened one? And what does it mean to be awakened? Those are the main questions that I will be addressing in my short offering. These talks, by the way, are not to be construed as lectures dealing with ideas, although of course we cannot avoid using ideas, but these are meant to be pointers for practitioners in earnest search for their own true self, practitioners in earnest search for awakening for themselves. So these pointers are meant precisely to be guidelines for each and every one of you as you sit there in your own place, as you sit in your chosen location where you can enter into that stillness, to these verbal pointers that may help you in realizing your way. Rather than just going about it alone, we can all sit on our own in separate ways, and then maybe somehow or other we may be able to come to a point of realization as our hearts are aspiring for. But it is a very, very effective and you can say even a surefire way of getting there if we are accompanied by a community who are also on the same path. So we are supporting one another, and that's what Sangha means, and that will be something that will be addressed a couple of days from now. But today, what is awakening? First of all, who is the awakened one? There are four levels that come to mind as we consider this question. Who is the awakened one? Who is Buddha? Or what is Buddha? What is it to be Buddha? The first point, of course, is to look in our own history and examine the person who was first called Buddha in history. Well, there may have been others, but this is the one whose name left an impact, and not just the name, but his life and his way of living made an impact on countless numbers of people after him, and even now that we look to him, this human being who lived in a specific time and a specific place in history, as a model of what awakening is all about. And this, of course, is no other than Siddhartha Gautama, a son of a very wealthy ruler in the northern part of India around the 5th or 6th century before the Common Era. This young man was born in a privileged family, and he had everything he could could ever dream of or want as a human being. His father was wealthy, so he could have anything that money could buy. He had all of the benefits of a loving and warm family. He had people who were serving him as part of the household and so on, so that he could not want for anything more in terms of material possessions. As far as his own future horizon, he already had it made. He was called, he was already destined to inherit his father's position as ruler, and so he would be the one who would reign over the vast territory that his father was ruler of. So his future was already assured. He'll be a great king if all went according to plan. And so in that regard, and then of course, as far as his own needs for pleasure and so on, his father made assurance that he would also have all that he wanted. So they would have these parties and they would have these very, very lavish banquets and so on. And so from all counts, he had everything that any human being could ever want in terms of what our material aspect or physical being called for. In short, he had what in the Hindu tradition are called the wants, the first three wants or desires of a human being: the desire for pleasure, the desire for possessions, the desire for power. There's a fourth that I'll talk about after this, but soon after. But these three are aspects that we ourselves somehow tend to look for in our own human life. If we recall, once a baby is born, the main thing that motivates a baby's actions are what is called the pleasure principle, the need for that sense of being that need for being in a place where one can find pleasure as opposed to pain and so on. And then as we grow up, we also see that there are things around us that we begin to want. I want this, I want that, I want that toy, or I want that corner, I want that house, and so on. And so we spend our lives acquiring these possessions, acquiring these wants in terms of our material possessions. And if we look at the majority of our fellow human beings today, we can see how our day-to-day lives 24/7 are driven by this need and desire for more possessions, a need to really be secure that we will not want for anything, especially when we grow older and when we are now in a place where we cannot do things for ourselves. So we want to be secured in material possessions and so on. And then, of course, we are seeking for a kind of power that will enable us to do things in the way I want and so on. So these three, pleasure, possessions, and power, are the three drives that propel human beings in their day-to-day activities. And he was not an exception, except that he already had what he could, all that he could ever want in terms of these three realms. So given that, somehow he had the time and the leeway to look at himself and ask, is that all there is? Is this really what the fullness of human life is all about? Fulfilling the needs for pleasure, power, and possessions. Many human beings are still on the way to getting what they want in terms of these three, but he himself already had these, and so he had that leeway to think, really, is that all there is? Many of you may remember a song of Peggy Lee sometime in the 50s or 60s, was it? Is that all there is? And that question that somehow pops up in our own inner consciousness can be the goad for us to go on a search for something more. No, that is not all there is. There is more to being human than just fulfilling your needs for pleasure, power, and possessions. And the Hindu tradition also attests to this. The fourth want of a human being, according to the Hindu tradition, which was very influential for centuries and still has a very influential, um, is still very influential to this day, talks about the human need for liberation, moksha, the human need for realizing something beyond anything that we can ever touch or measure, beyond the finite. In short, a human need for something infinite, that human heart that longs for something beyond what can be measured and what can be seen and touched and so on, a longing for the infinite. And in the Hindu tradition, they call that Brahman, that which is bigger than anything that can ever be imagined. And so they formed all sorts of philosophical concepts regarding this Brahman, but that also became another set of concepts. Now, whenever I recall this, whenever I recount this aspect that comes from the Hindu tradition, that there is a human spark for the infinite that longs to be fulfilled in each and every human being who comes to an awareness of oneself as a human being. I remember Augustine of Hippo, who also had a very tumultuous life when he was a young man. He was a very gifted young man, so he was eloquent and won a lot of awards in debating and so on, and was bound for a very high place in the empire. And then he began to have some inner turmoils, and to make a long story short, he converted to Christianity in his early 30s, and in his later age, he wrote about his own spiritual journey. And one very, very memorable line that comes from his journal called Confessions is that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. By thee, he meant the infinite and boundless God, the source of love and life, that is at the center of the Christian tradition. But what I wanted to point out is that Augustine experienced that spark of the infinite that made him look at his profligate life that was just seeking power and pleasure and possessions, and realize, no, this is not what human beings are all about. There's something more in us that drives us, that propels us to seek something that is infinite, beyond concept, beyond whatever we can imagine. And so that led him on his spiritual search, and he eventually became a very spiritual person that led others, and he wrote many books to guide others on the spiritual path and on a theological, with a theological framework. But what I wanted to point out in taking Augustine as an example is that that spark of the infinite is also in each and every one of us. And that is what the Buddha realized at that stage when he was about 29 years old. And as he looked at himself, he realized, if I stay here in the palace, and he was now at this point where he was married and he already had a son with his lovely wife, he realized that he would never be able to pursue this spark of the infinite if he just stayed there and did what he was expected to do. Remember, he was expected to inherit the place of his father, the ruler, and so on. So he would be so busy with matters of state, busy with family, busy with taking care of things, that he felt this was not going to allow him to follow that path. And so he made a very firm resolution to leave that social status and leave all his possessions behind and go off as a wandering ascetic. in India at that time. At that time, there were many people who were also wandering ascetics, seeking for that infinite that they also felt a spark of. And there were many teachers who came up, or there were many people who did that and came up with many very helpful insights. And so this was a time of the proliferation of many kinds of teachers who, in their own spiritual path, had realized something or other, and they were teaching it to others. So they said, so there were at least 60 different philosophies at the time, it is said, and many teachers from these different schools that were gathering disciples to lead people to whatever they felt was a realization that that was the fulfillment of their desire for that infinite. But so Siddhartha then started listening to these teachers, and he realized what his heart was longing for could not be fulfilled by any of these teachings either. So he set that aside, and he resolved to find out for himself what this spark of the infinite was all about. So, as you all know the story, after 6 years of wandering about and seeking, asking one teacher after another, he then realized he was not getting anywhere. So he simply sat down under a tree and resolved, I will not budge from this tree until I realize what my heart is seeking. Fortunately, he was helped by a young woman then who had some ghee, as I said, some goat's milk, some curdled goat's milk that she was able to give to this young ascetic. And so he was able to feed himself and nourish himself back to a state of health. So with that new state of being healthy and being aware, he sat there and entered into a deep place of stillness. It is said that that happened on the night of the seventh day of the 12th month. That is December 7th in the Western calendar. And that evening, he decided not to budge from his seat until he realized what he was looking for. So on the morning of the 8th of December in the Western calendar, the 8th of the 12th month, as he sat there in perfect stillness, and the light of the morning star arose on the horizon, and his gaze met that light from the morning star, something opened up, and the whole universe opened up to him in a new realization of what? That is the question that is all that is before us. What did the Buddha realize? We can only see from its fruits that from that point on, he experienced deep peace, and he stayed on, and he felt that he could stay there for the rest of his life because of that tremendous peace and joy that he felt in that experience. And as he continued sitting there, just relishing that joy and peace, he looked around and realized that there were still so many beings, so many human beings, first of all, who are still lost and are still going around seeking pleasure, power, possessions, and therefore are making a mess of their own lives, not realizing what is really what it really is that can really make a human being truly at peace and joyful and happy and wise and compassionate. So he was moved to go out and move back into town to be able to share what he realized with everyone. And the rest is history. What we have after that would be the words and the teachings that came from this person, Siddhartha Gautama, who was now called the Buddha or Awakened One from then on. So that's what we have as our heritage that we are partaking of. Zen is one branch that comes from this tradition of the Awakened One. So we won't go into the historical aspects, but just to note that when we say Buddha, the first jewel or first treasure, primarily we refer to the human being who lived in history, who had this spiritual search and who had his own inner struggle and made a resolution to set aside everything that was not helpful for the search and devoted himself totally to the search for that spark of the infinite in him. And it bore fruit in what he realized after 6 years of searching and after coming to a place of sitting in stillness. We are privileged to have that legacy with us, so that if anyone already is in that similar state of mind as Siddhartha was when he began asking, what is life all about? Is that all there is? Is there not something more that human beings can really experience and realize that will give us true joy and true peace and will enable us to realize, aha, this is what I have been born for. And with this now, my life is complete. If we are among those who have been touched by that spark, and we are now in the process of enabling it to inflame our whole lives, then we are in direct line with Siddhartha, who became Buddha, Gautama Buddha. And so all of those human beings who followed that path that the Buddha showed and the Buddha led himself are also by that historical connection included in what we call Buddha. So when we say Buddha, it is first of all the historical Buddha, the historical Gautama, and then all of those in history who followed that path that he taught, who themselves became awakened and lived lives of peace and wisdom and compassion, contributing to humanity. There are many that are named in history, but there are many more who are nameless, but who lived their own lives in that way, in their own time and in their own place, and lived having discovered that where they could always lighten that spark of infinity in them and share it with others. And so beyond Buddhism, those major figures in the world's religions can also be said to have discovered that spark and have taught others in their own way. So for those of us who are Christian, we can really see that Jesus is such a person who awakened to that spark, and not only awakened, embodied it and shared it with everyone that he knew at that point, and out of that came the tradition of Christianity. Now, I'm not making Jesus into a Buddhist, but we are simply saying that what we talk about in Buddhism is not an exclusive one, but it's also something that is discovered in other traditions in their own way. So now it is our task, for those who follow the Buddhist tradition in this path of awakening, to see where we can have those points of intersection with people from other faith traditions, so that we will see that we are all in one community of humanity, community of sentient beings, in search for this path of awakening, following that spark of the infinite that we have discovered in us. So the third level of Buddha then would be none other than you yourself, each and every one of us who have been touched by that spark and are now in the process of allowing it to fully inflame our lives, so that we can be a light to the world ourselves, not from our own ego, but from the light that has been there all along, that we are now called to share with everyone. So now I would like to just round up with this invitation. You are, as yourself, inherently one who is in the midst of that big receptacle wherein we all share in that spark of the infinite. We are all embraced in that big ocean where that spark, forgive the mixed metaphors, is in us, so that horizon of the infinite is right there in our own lives. And the way we can allow that to emerge and be recognized and be embodied in our day to day activities is to simply step back from our own activities that are based on our little self trying to find something outside of itself, and allow that little self to just be quiet, sit still, be aware, and let it be settled in the here and now. And that is exactly what our Zen practice is all about. As we sit here doing nothing but simply being, we allow that spark of the infinite to be stoked so that we can realize how it is there as a quiet light shining through each and everything that we can ever imagine, shining through each and everything in the universe. And it is coming from within us, within each and every one of us, so that we see that we all share in that spark. And that spark is now something that glows through the whole of our existence. What it will imply will be that we will see that this little I, me, mine that was the center of our universe will be dislodged, and our lives will no longer be led based on the whims and desires of this little egoic self that we call by our own personal name. But this personal individual being that I am is now thrown into that big ocean of wisdom and compassion that the spark is leading us to. So, with those encouraging words, I hope I invite us all to continue sitting in our own respective places and just allow that stillness to reign so that that horizon of the infinite can open up, and we will realize that infinite treasure that is in our midst, and we will be able to really be filled with joy and inner peace and contentment in realizing that treasure within us, and will be moved to share all that we are and all that we have to the world, wounded as it is, deteriorating with all of our ecological and of our tribalistic conflicts, and with the inequality and so on, so much pain and so much grief in the world. We will be able to share this infinite treasure with the world that is hurting in a way that we may become wounded healers ourselves, driven and inspired and empowered by the spark of infinite in all of us. In short, that Buddha nature that is in all of us. So let us activate that Buddha nature and allow that to become alive in our realization of who we are in the midst of our stillness, in the midst of our sitting practice, that will take us out of the cushion to gift ourselves to the world. Let me stop here and invite you all to enter into that place and be burned by that spark yourself, and let yourself be a light to the world from the power of that spark of the infinite.
Let us chant boundless compassion. Boundless compassion. As flowing sounds of waves of Buddha rising. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Blessed pure heart always rejoices in the light we call this, in the dark
Let your heart always be